Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used their historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Professor Fabian Prieto-Nañez is an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech University. Fabian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Greg, for inviting me to this space to talk about my research and my experience.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you're researching about at the moment?
Well, my research is a kind of like research that I'm doing for my book manuscript about a satellite dish in the Caribbean in the 1980s and the kind of beginning of satellite television directly to your home. So it's a huge process. I have been tracking that from the perspective of what was happening in the Caribbean in the 1980s. And I found this kind of intersection between legislation, technological kind of like expertise, but also entrepreneurship that has launched me to kind of observe this in a very kind of particular way, like starting from the underground of what was going on. Basically, my sources in my dissertation were mostly about Colombia, that is my hometown. So I could gather some of these information from archives that are kind of not as established as the ones that I had found here in the United States, but that they give you like ideas of like traces of how people did this process of building their own satellite dishes in the Caribbean. And I am not talking about only like one or two. There were a huge movement of people building their satellite dishes in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. So that is what I'm trying to find out. Okay, if this is the story told from the Caribbean, how this intersects with the United States, and the connections are really interesting. If you take a look of the history of television and cable television in the United States in the 70s and 80s, the satellite dish represent a huge transition into a new business model. Companies like HBO or CNN or this so-called superstation in that moment were really pushing the boundaries of media distribution. So if this story can be told from the perspective of the United States, it's also great, but I'm taking the stance of how can it be if we start thinking from the Caribbean? Because my main point is that the things that happen in the Caribbean help to shape the socio-technical system that was emerging. It pushed ideas of copyright, it pushed ideas of cost or privatization of television in the region. So it's like not like a top-down kind of process where you tell the story of what happened of the United States and tell, oh yeah, this influenced the Caribbean. But I want to kind of bring this more like a way of thinking that what happened in the Caribbean was useful for understanding the changes in how satellite television could be used for distribution.
What put Hagley on your radar as a potential resource to help you uncover the story?
That's a great question, because as I mentioned, my first attempt finishing my dissertation was to kind of find sources in Latin America and particularly Colombia, and then finding some amateur satellite entrepreneurs who were talking about the Caribbean, but they were based in rural spaces in the United States. So I was doing this kind of work and it was self-sufficient, but I started doing a collaboration with one professor from University of Maryland and his PhD advisee, David Kirch and Marta Villamor. I present in the Business History Conference my work on entrepreneurs in the Caribbean, and they will figure out, oh yeah, this is a great case for studying what he calls institutional voids in business strategy. Is a concept that is useful to understand how these kind of entrepreneurs emerge in the context of uncertainty. So I was like, okay, I just came here to the business history. I don't know what to do. Let's start work on that. And it has been a great experience. I have been doing a lot of work with them. They are using topic modeling, like this kind of like seeing all the sources at once. I am more like this historian who take every kind of source and read it and try to find meaning and make connection. So it was a great opportunity for me to kind of like observe my project from a different perspective. And one thing that happened there was kind of like suggestion. We start to talk about this project in different venues. And one of the suggestions was like, why don't we include like not only the perspective of the amateurs or so-called pirates, because that was one label that they start to have. And we start to include institutional sources. So what they did in this kind of topic modeling was to track that through Hein Online and these legal sources or using the Congress hearings. But I got curious of, okay, if I want to get more information about the institutional setting to the thing that happened, what can I do? And I start to find out places like Hagley Museum and other universities that they have the private archives of CEOs or people who were working. So I found that an opportunity for going into the Hagley Library. The RCA, I mean, there are many works done with that archive. And I didn't know the dimension of what RCA was until I get into the Hagley Library. But my first thought was like, okay, I will go straight into Astro-Electronics Division, which was this kind of like very design-oriented and science, like research and development area in RCA. And it started to give me like, okay, what is going on here? How these companies are building this infrastructure, aiming at a particular idea of how this might work, and finding that on the kind of outside of that or in the institutional void that David mentioned or points out, there were these all other entrepreneurs going on. So I wanted to go into the library first to read that from the perspective of amateurs, or like from this kind of like experience that I had learning how these things were moving, and see if the RCA had any concerns about intellectual property or how this was being misused. And it was interesting because you see in the institutional kind of like mindset that they were aiming to a particular use of the satellites and a particular system that they wanted to build. These other competitors were not, I mean, they were more concerned about like issues of copyright or like issues of like not being able to build enough infrastructure for the satellite to work. So that was like my first kind of impression when I get into the Hagley, like, okay, this is another story, like another line that I want to see if that crosses with the story that I'm looking for. So yes, that is what I started doing, the kind of like work at Hagley Library, initially with the Astro-Electronics Division, but then I found out that it's not only about research and development, and this corporation, as you know, have like different like areas. And the Hagley Library also hosts the collection for the Global International, well, I don't remember the exact name of the division right now, but it's one that was in charge of more communication and marketing of how to offer services to different companies. So when I enter into that more like way of how the business was being designed, everything start to make sense. Like everything start to make sense about like RCI's idea of creating their own closed system. And they were developing that in the 1980s. And then an interesting thing that I found in the archives, and I'm still working on that because I brought all the information. I brought one part of one chapter about the kind of like launch of the satellite. But there's still like what happened and why this project didn't move on. And I wanted to know if there were any kind of like relations with what was happening in the context of the emergence of these satellite dishes in the Caribbean and in the United States and Canada. So that is where I found that I start to enter the archive, not to tell the story of RCA, but how to include RCA in this kind of network of actors or institutions at that point.
What an interesting project. And I love the use of archival materials here. Was there a particular document or set of sources that were really exciting, or perhaps provided you with a smoking gun?
Yes, and as you know, for many of us historians entering into the archives is to find out like so many different paths and start new projects. So I had to be just like conscious, like, okay, I can do this later on my academic life. But at the beginning, I was like, oh, yes, maybe that aspect of the design. And as I'm in an STS department, I wanted to know like what is the research and development of a corporation. I teach a class of innovation in context for students, undergraduates. So I had this view of like how innovation will happen in the United States. So one of the things that I found out is like many of the topics that I was discussing in class for different cases, they all converge into my approach to the initial archives. And I'm specifically talking about the Astro Electronics division, where you see all these kind of like technical reports, how they are trying to innovate, how they are reading the competition, how the regulation also shape the possibilities of developing certain technologies. So that was evident there. But as you know, I was more into, okay, I want to talk about the Caribbean satellites. So, okay, I will leave this from that. And then I moved into the American RCA communication like division that was more interested in marketing and developing products to be sold. So that is where I found, in terms of boxes, I was finished with 3 boxes and then I was done. I said, oh, maybe not. But the great librarians and archivists told me, oh, yes, there is also this another collection. And I found it and I said, okay, bring it to me. I have like 1 week and I almost did everything about the first collection in the first 2 days. Give me that. And it was really amazing because it was more about the development of the direct satellite broadcast, the project. And it was a document that I still want to read because what I found interesting that, as I mentioned, I was with this idea that they were not looking at what was going on in this kind of satellite amateurs. But there is one document that was about how they can get their satellite dishes from one of these amateur satellite dishers producer. I don't remember. It was in the south of the United States, still the United States, but that person was linked with the whole business that was emerging in the US and in the Caribbean. So I was like very interested in how this big company realized that the process that was going on in this kind of more small business was maybe a source for something that they have to care about. And is the idea that, okay, if we talk about satellite infrastructure, all the kind of magnificent things that we can talk about is the only device in out of space that is the satellite. But the main concern, and I found that when I was start to connect all these sources, is that yes, the real problem was how to build a cheap satellite dish that can be commercialized among the uses of the satellite. So you have the satellite, but you also need the satellite dish or the Earth station. And that document revealed me like a longer history of like how RCI was also considering building Earth station in the 1970s, how much that was and how costly and expensive was to build a satellite dish, and see how these kind of amateur satellite dish entrepreneurs get to the low cost device that start to change the market and kind of like move things in a different direction from that expected. And it's interesting because that moment when you see this corporation talking with these kind of isolated actors, it's for me very meaningful to see how these things start, to bring, as I told you at the beginning, how this start to influence the whole design of the system. It's not so that one in particular is the one that I'm more interested right now. But of course, as I mentioned, there are many other things that are around that I think they can enter into the kind of discussion that I'm having with the satellite dishes.
That's such an exciting discovery where one document can bring these 2 streams of your research into direct contact, into direct conversation with one another. That's such an exciting breakthrough in the archive.
Yes, and as I told you, it really gave me like a story to tell about, the device itself of the satellite dish, how there were many, and maybe, yes, I was not aware of that when I was in the archives, but RCA had this big project in Alaska in the 1970s, where they wanted to launch the system of domestic satellite, because that is also the context of what we are talking about, that the kind of the satellite that RCI was planning was for domestic use in the United States, not for this kind of like global use of satellites like Intelsat or Comsat, that were the ones that start this idea that yes, satellites are good for global communication. But in the 70s, the United States and the market in the United States start to push the government to consider that, yes, we need domestic satellites. So the original idea of RCI was also not to develop this satellite that can cover big areas or can be used for like spreading education and culture, which is very in the ideas behind Comsat. But it was more about developing a marketplace using for different sources. And that Alaska project was one of the first where they were being pushed to, okay, you got the satellite, but we need that Alaska is covered as a totality. So how are you going to build these satellite dishes? And that is where I saw like, okay, yes, there is a concern about how these satellite dishes should be built and also commercialized, which is not the expertise of RCA, but that's another stream of other set of businesses that enter into the market. So so yes, I think that is also giving me a line to follow how different actors in this socio-technical system were aiming at developing a satellite dish that was low cost. And if you think about it, it's like also a process of making it a miniaturization, because yes, you will see, I mean, I put in my background, for those who are viewing the YouTube video, a glimpse of a fair in Miami where some of these dishes were exposed. But if you see, they are kind of big compared. I mean, these are big compared to what we are knowing now as satellite dish. So this process of miniaturization is also like very important for me in the process. And there are some ways of how you can track that also in the archives to see how these different competitions were also ideas about how these satellite dishes could be in public space, how they were affecting like the environment, discussion about the size of these satellite dishes are also part of the problem of designing an affordable but also like good looking satellite dish. I don't know if you know about that, but they used to be called like big ugly dishes back in the 80s. So they had a bad reputation in terms of aesthetics.
Sure. And well, I'm really curious about these grassroots business people, these innovators who are with very limited resources, making technical breakthroughs that then have to be replicated by the big companies like RCA. Could you perhaps explain a little bit more about them?
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, because the kind of clue that I have been following, one is the emergence of community antenna television in the United States. These moms and pops, as a lot of people call them, businesses that help to extend the infrastructure of broadcasting television in the States. But there is also an interesting and more global phenomenon, like international phenomenon, that is behind this. I'm talking about the Caribbean and the way of how these things were distributed, were also through the networks of radio amateurs, because they have the expertise to understand what an antenna means, and they were very kind of experimenting with these things. So the idea that they are kind of like in a different location doesn't mean that they don't have access to historical resources. That the idea that communicating, getting access to media has a long trajectory attached to community antenna television and radio amateurs. So when you find this, it's like, okay, yeah, they might have like fewer resources, but as a network, they were really connected to what was happening in the 70s and 80s in terms of electronic production. So some interesting about this case is that these satellite dishes were sold as modular, like these kind of kits that you can ensemble, and there is a lot of like do-it-yourself ideas behind, okay, you can build this, it's low tech and it's low cost. So if you put all your labor, your effort, and a lot of hours to build this, you can make this on your own. The step that went further is like, okay, you can do it and replicate that and they start to see this as a business opportunity. And the phenomenon that I am seeing is like how some of these amateurs who has like a very kind of sometimes clear code of value that this is for entertainment and for the sake of knowledge, took the decision to move into the idea of, okay, we can make this a business, and not only we can expand it here in the rural areas of the United States, Canada also have a lot of things to offer, because there is a kind of like interesting history about the development of satellite television and media between Canada and the United States, but also in the Caribbean, where the situation kind of can be compared with Canada and interest. Like, yes, there is a different approach to this. There were transitions going on in the Caribbean during the decade. So those are the kind of things that I want to try to find out, how these networks that exist about community and television and radio amateurs help to build that, and to get to the point that, as you said, they get in contact with this institution. They went into the Senate, at least in the case of the United States, the satellite dish movement pushed a lot of new decisions about how to use this as a personal device. They redefine different aspects of cable television as well. And of course, the main topic that I also interested in, how they help to redefine copyright. And in the context of like, it's not only a case for the United States, how this redefinition of copyright start to kind of push the way of how this was happening in the Caribbean region, how there were technical fixes like scrambling and encoding, but there were also like governmental policies to stop the use of these satellites, to specifically in the Ronald Reagan's kind of like presidential term, when there was this free, I mean, it's one of the first ideas of free trade agreements, that is the Caribbean Basin of 1982. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because everything that you read in that kind of like that kind of document about the Caribbean Basin Initiative is about like trade and things that you can push the Caribbean island to turn then into free market. But one aspect that was there was the issue of copyright, and especially addressing what was happening with the satellite dishes. So it's just to bring that kind of like also history of how copyright as an US kind of particular approach to intellectual property had expanded. And not only what we know as this international idea of copyright in the internet years with Napsters and all of these platforms, I want to make the case that these things started in an early stage, and that the Caribbean played a huge role in, okay, of course, you can name my book Pirates of the Caribbean. I have a lot of like people telling me to do that, but I want to make that a more complex situation, why this idea of piracy also pushed the design of the technological systems in terms of like new technology like the scramblers, but also in terms of how these things were defined at a global scale.
Well, Fabian, what a great project. And thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us. Really interesting.
Yes, thank you for asking me. I know that there are too many things, but it's great that I have been just moving into my topic by highlighting like, okay, the Hagley is a very important part, but it's another kind of like set of like sources, and in terms of like this kind of idea of a socio-technical system of, okay, they have something, and if I can write the history of RCA and satellites in one way, but I want to put them in a different kind of like leverage. So like, okay, what are these guys doing? We are doing this, and why did it fail, or these kind of things are the ones that are now interesting me as I bring more actors or like institutions into the equation.
Well, that's great. And I can't wait to read the book when you're all done. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.